Greetings and welcome. It's Friday, January 19th, 2024, and time for the town meeting talk show here on KLAM. Because not long ago, I got an email with a news release attached to it from the Alaska Senate Majority, no less, talking about how Senator Dunbar had pre-filed some very interesting legislation. Now, some of you may remember Senator Dunbar as Cordova young person Forrest Dunbar, who graduated and went on to remarkable things here. And when I saw this, I said, well, I know this guy. He used to be on the radio as a youth in our Friday Night Live music show we used to do, it seems like 6,000 years ago now. But a prolific young broadcaster and now senator who has put forth legislation that would establish the Alaska Mental Health and Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. And as you're going to learn, the idea here, which is being explored by the FDA, so this is not like fringy stuff. What they're trying to do is see if these substances, long thought of as largely destructive, potentially dangerous if abused street drugs, could be used in a supervised setting, as they have been, by the way, in some other countries, to help with some very tough conditions, especially for veterans, like anxiety, addiction, PTSD, suicidality. So the FDA has been doing actual clinical research to see if these substances, well, which like most substances, if abused, make a mess out of things, but under careful, controlled clinical settings, under the direct supervision of doctors and psychologists, could you use substances like LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA to treat some of these severe cases, not just in veterans, obviously, but potentially in the general population. And you'll hear it's a fascinating conversation. You know, he's not like a legalize everything, one of those. But what he's trying to do, as you'll hear, is explore the possibility, mainly so that if the FDA or similar organizations like that sign off on a way to make these compounds available, that there will be a structure, that it will have already been talked about in hypothetical form in Alaska. So that wouldn't have to be done afterwards. It's like the FDA says there is great potential for these things, and then a state would have to start from scratch. And that's what he's basically trying to avoid. With a real diverse panel of potential participants, including indigenous people who have a lot of cultural insight, as I'm sure many folks know, into the curative properties of substances that mainstream medicine might not think about looking towards. So we'll go over who might be involved and what the goals of the task force would be. And as always, we are brought to you by Cordova Wireless Communications, which is your local provider of cell phone and wireless data services, and also your local provider of your local talk show. So we hope you're ready to learn this morning. Senator Forrest Dunbar, former Cordovan, now Democrat of Anchorage, talking about the possibility of an Alaska Mental Health and Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. That's the subject of today's town meeting. Senator Dunbar. That's not a title I used to have to use on you when you would come over for the radio show. How are things?
Things are good. I'm down here in Juneau, just arrived a couple days ago, and we just gabbled into session.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I knew that one of these days you would have a position of this magnitude because of all of our Friday Night Live people, you were the one that questioned me about the First Amendment issues involved in playing music that had warning labels on it. That never settled too well with you. And I thought, well,
I remember.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember. In my defense, I was 16.
I know. No, but see, the seeds, I feel like the seeds were there. Like one day this young man is going to rule the world, or at least help try to make it a better place in some fashion, because he's thinking even at this young age. And that was That was
Yeah, certainly not rule the world, but especially when I was younger, I always sort of clashed with authority, for better or worse.
yeah,
And I started to channel that a little bit in my 20s and
yeah.
eventually got the opportunity to run for office, and I was on the Agriculture Assembly for 7 years, which was a really interesting experience and
Hmm.
good at times and tough at other times. But no, I'm really honored to be able to represent the neighborhoods I represent in the state Senate. And of course, state Senate also you deal with statewide issues. So there's a
Sure.
lot of interesting things that come across my table.
Now, I forget, were you born in Cordova or did you guys move there?
No. So until I was 7, I lived in a little village, well, a town next to a village called Eagle on the Yukon River in the
Hmm.
interior. And so my mom was a substitute teacher up there. My dad worked for Fish and Game. And then after the oil spill, a couple years after the oil spill, we moved down to Cordova. So I was
Yeah.
7 when we moved down. They brought a lot of Fish and Game personnel in.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was there through graduating high school. So I do sort of refer to Cordova as my hometown, although when I was very little, I lived in Eagle. So
Sure.
I kind of think of both of them as my hometown, to be honest.
So what do you remember about growing up there?
Oh, I mean, everything.
Yeah.
Cordova, I mean, those are the most formative years of your life, really, right?
Sure.
I mean, I was there from second grade until graduating high school. And you just, with 1 year, I was able to spend abroad in Japan. But other than that, I
Yeah.
was there. You never really, I've thought about this a lot. Like, you're always kind of the person you were in high school, I think. I
Hmm.
mean, you can grow and change and whatnot, but those formative years from about, I don't know, fourth grade through graduation, whatever it is,
Hmm.
that really is how you see yourself. And so, I was kind of a nerdy kid, wasn't a super successful athlete, although I did play on the basketball team.
Yeah.
And that's still kind of who I see myself as, even though my life really changed in college and afterwards. And,
Hmm.
I had the opportunity this summer to come back to Cordova too and just spend a couple of days there. And shout out to Mrs. Church, who allowed me to sleep in her guest room, which was really nice of her. She's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I got to see some old friends and walk out on the breakwater. And I told, I was with my partner Tasha came with me, and I told her, there isn't a square inch of Cordova that I don't have some kind of memory associated with.
Yeah.
I walk around there, and just every street, almost every building,
Yeah.
I feel like something, me and my friends, or school, or work, or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And no, it's a place that will always be a part of who I am.
Yeah. Did you like the new center? Did you get to walk around in there, the Cordova Center at all?
Yeah, of course. My mom, she was, I think, the first librarian working there, or one of the first. So, because she moved back to Cordova, her and my father did rather. After they'd been in Fairbanks for a while, she came back down and was the public librarian, and
Yeah.
she worked there, and I got to visit her there. And yeah, I went back this summer too, and it's just a beautiful facility. I haven't been in the new Science Center yet. I really do want to. I want to check that out because I remember I remember studying for the National Ocean Sciences Bowl in the old, down by the cannery,
Hmm.
down by the harbor, the old Science Center, and,
Yeah.
I'd love to go check out the new one at some point.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they'd be happy to have you. So how you said that you served on the assembly for a while, and then
Yep.
this opportunity. So do you feel like, other than the obvious, you said the formative years, was there anything as you look back on it now as an adult that about your Cordova upbringing that particularly prepared you? Any buddy, any teacher, or anything like that sort of prepared you for this role that you're in now?
Oh, for sure. I think it's unique to represent a part of Anchorage and yet have had the opportunity to grow up in rural Alaska, and have the opportunity to have worked on commercial fishing boats and, have that sort of upbringing. And so I'm on the resources committee now, and we deal with issues like fisheries. And I think that it's very helpful to have had that lived experience. And of course, I still have friends in Cordova that reach out to me sometimes, and I reach out to them when there's an issue, that is before them. Like, for example, there's a discussion about Area M and that fishery, and I heard from some folks. Obviously, Cordova is not in Area M, but there are
Right.
commercial fishermen that are interested in those kind of fisheries issues. So that certainly matters. I think there is this unfortunate tendency among some folks to kind of pit rural and urban Alaska against each other. And it goes both ways. You know,
Right.
I think people in urban Alaska don't appreciate the expense of things out in rural Alaska and how challenging things can be when we're talking about things like the BSA, for example,
Right.
base student allocation, you know, and the funding that's needed to keep those schools running. And we, of course, we had teachers and administrators and students from Cordova and other places come to Juneau last year and explain how they needed us to raise the BSA. And we were able to get some funding, but not nearly enough. And we'll try to do that again this year.
Yeah.
But so it goes that way, you know, on the urban side. But I say also, you know, I will say that there are folks that are like, oh, you know, Anchorage is a great city, but it's not really Alaska. And I just don't subscribe to that. And I'll say that, you know, growing up in Cordova, you know, you pass through on a school trip, you know, a band trip or a basketball trip. And Anchorage kind of seemed like, you know, the Fifth Avenue Mall and the Diamond Center, and then maybe some high school gyms. And I didn't really appreciate, you know, the community that's there, you know, and didn't really understand when I was growing up there. You know, there's real Alaskans there living their lives and going out, you know, driving to more remote areas and doing the same kind of things, you know, we do, you know, hunting and fishing and or playing basketball or football or whatnot. And so, you know, I just, we're all Alaskans at the end of the day. And so, you know, you try if you're a state senator or a state house rep, or certainly if you were the governor, you know, you try to represent all Alaskans and try to, you know, we're not going to succeed. Anchorage is not going to thrive if rural Alaska suffers, and vice versa.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I have a great appreciation for that idea of having existed in both worlds and being able to see from maybe you know, that hybrid view exactly what you said, you know, that even in large areas, there are small communities within large urban areas.
For sure.
While they interact more with their neighbors or the other communities, you know, that they still function, whether it's something as small as a church or even a neighborhood or whatever. Those communities exist, and we, you know, over homogenizing everybody. Just that, you know, an Anchorage person is not an Anchorage person is not an Anchorage person any more than Cordovans are. So that's neat that you're able to bring that to it.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, and so I represent Mountain View, Russian Jack, Airport Heights, Campbell Park, and UMed, which includes the University of Alaska Anchorage, APU, and two of the three major hospitals. And it's just like you said, you know, there are these communities like, you know, Mountain View is very unique. Airport Heights is very different. And then you've got things like East High School, right? East High School has as many students as there are people in Cordova, you know, and within East High School, there are different communities, you know, that I've had the opportunity to interact with. And yeah, it's just been a real privilege, you know, to do that. And one of my favorite things about being in politics is you get to door knock, you know, and go and talk to people face to face. And I've just met thousands and thousands of people, you know, during my time doing this work. And it's just been really great. And, you know, occasionally people are mean. You know, I've definitely been screamed at a few times. I've had people yell at me, you know, get off their lawn, essentially. Yeah. But the vast majority of people are not like that. The vast majority of people they mean well and they want to have a talk, you know, and yeah, and they're really interested in the work we're doing.
Good. Well, speaking of the work, we'll get to the topic here now, and I appreciate you letting me wax nostalgic with you a bit. But this task force now, Psychedelic Medicine Task Force, I got to think that whoever named it would kind of, you know, in a way, it's almost too bad there isn't a less triggery name, you know, because that's instantly going to draw to mind certain things. But let me, and I want to go into this saying, by the way, I have seen portrayals of the potential for this kind of thing. I'm fascinated by it. That's why I reached out to you and wanted to talk to you about it. So what is, separate psychedelic medicine from some of the preconceived notions about psychedelic compounds. And what is this area of study as you understand it?
Yeah, you know, there is another term, that and now I'm blanking on the term. There is another term for these kind of medicines, but it's kind of an esoteric term, and so we thought it was sort of more honest to just use the term psychedelic, despite the negative connotations that you sort of allude to, right? That people think about this and they think of, you know, drug trips in the 70s or whatnot, you know, and they have a certain view of it. But the truth is, and look, here, I serve in the Alaska Army National Guard. I mean, you kind of know me, like I was a little bit of a square. Growing up, I was not partaking in substances even in high school.
Sure.
And I certainly don't now. In fact, I'm randomly drug tested, as a lot of people in the National Guard, as we all are.
Yeah.
So this is not something that I partake in, or am particularly interested in partaking in. And so it wasn't on my radar till last year. I think it was a year and a half ago or so. People started talking to me, and I had some advocates reach out to me and basically say, do you realize the kind of progress they're making with PTSD, with addiction treatment, with alleviating veteran suicide, with some of the issues I really care about, right?
Yeah.
That these are, stop thinking of them as recreational drugs and think of them as medicine, and medicine that can be used in a controlled way in a doctor's office. Essentially, it's not always a doctor's office. There's other ways to do it, and there's traditional medicines as well. But they basically, by essentially rewiring your brain, some of these drugs can permanently impact things like addiction and PTSD. And that, to me, sounded too good to be true. And so I started to do some research on this. And the truth is, it's got to the point where the federal government, the FDA, is actually doing stage 3 trials on some of these things, stage 2 in some substances cases, stage 3 in some others, which means they're very far along in this research. And the results are just kind of astounding, that it really does seem to be an impactful treatment for some of the worst things that impact Alaska. I mean, if you ask someone sort of, what is the thing that is really troubling Alaska? Why does Alaska have these really high rates of domestic violence, of suicide, of sexual assault? I mean, there's a lot of different things, right? Where unfortunately we lead the nation. And a lot of that can be tied back to trauma and to addiction. Not everything. I'm not saying it's everything, but those are two of the things that really impact Alaska. And, we've seen opioids really devastate the state and some of the communities that I represent. And then, of course, again, like law enforcement and veterans are really impacted by PTSD. And these medicines, these drugs, appear to have real impacts on treating both of those. And so what my bill does is creates a task force, and that's kind of the first step, that would basically set up the regulatory framework so that when the FDA allows us to do so, we can license medical providers so that they are able to use these drug treatments.
Okay. And what have you learned in you said your quest for knowledge? You were fascinated by the stories of the outcomes. Are there any, obviously without violating anybody's privacy or anything like that, but what have you learned? Are there some actual case studies that you have looked through, people you've talked to that have had success?
Yes. So I've had people reach out to me personally saying that it's impacted their lives, where this has improved their lives. But there are these kind of underground veterans organizations right now that raise money to fly veterans out of the country to parts of the world where these are legal so they can get these kind of treatments. I mean, that's how desperate some people are to get these treatments. And I'll say that, so I'm meeting with a coalition of people who are interested in doing this. And these are real serious folks. Like the head of addiction medicine at Providence Hospital is one of the people who's working with us on this, and they have seen these kind of outcomes. Obviously, they can't administer these directly in Alaska now, although some people, I think, probably are. I'm not going to pry into that, but certainly not Providence, but maybe other providers. There are at least two other states, Oregon and Colorado, who have gone a lot further in legalizing these treatments, and they do have some results that are very promising. I'll say that there was one thing about the bill I want to highlight, and it was kind of a failing in Oregon and Colorado's efforts, and that is the presence and inclusion of indigenous voices. Some of these substances have been used by indigenous communities for literally thousands of years. And when they legalized it or partially legalized it in Oregon and Colorado, they didn't really have those voices in the tent, and they didn't really include them to the degree that they should have. And so our task force explicitly calls on the Native Health Board and some other organizations. And we've had conversations with South Central Foundation and Indigenous healers that are interested in doing this and in using these substances. And that licensure will probably look a bit different. And it might not be the kind of traditional licensure we think of, but we want people to be able to do these things safely in a controlled medical environment and legally.
Right, right. And so, what is it that has the proponents so excited about it? What is the potential? What are some of the results they believe they've seen?
So I should say that these treatments, my understanding of these treatments, and I am by no means an expert on the sort of medical side of things.
Right.
These treatments are not pleasant. That is, it's not fun for most people.
Uh-huh.
Some of the treatments can be basically like, 4 to 7 hours, and you are experiencing these drugs. You're in a controlled environment with a medical provider, and you have a really kind of unpleasant, almost sort of purge of emotions and images, and your brain is essentially rewired again in a way that is not pleasant. Mm-hmm. And then you have to spend hours working with someone who is trained, unpacking what you have experienced. And in some cases, people have reported basically like complete and permanent change. Mm. I mean, to the level of like, I was addicted to a substance, I am no longer addicted to that substance. Or I was haunted by this traumatic event, and I no longer have PTSD. And that I don't want to overpromise, but right. that is the kind of testimonials you see. And some of them are in, again, we're not talking about some like fly-by-night organization here. We're talking about real medical researchers, things that have appeared in medical journals, the FDA, and here's the thing, like there are medical drugs that we use, that we could be prescribed, that if they were used recreationally would not be medical. They would be something else, right? And opioids is one of the best examples, right? They can be very dangerous, but they're also very necessary for certain people experiencing pain, and they can be useful if prescribed and administered correctly. And sort of that's what we're talking about here, is these substances can have real positive, potentially permanent changes and impacts. And one other last note I'll say is this is not like a partisan issue. It's really interesting the kind of people that have reached out to me saying that they might support this, and folks that have experienced this in one way or another in their life, and see the potential here. And so I'm sort of excited by the idea. If there are these kind of substances that can really impact addiction and suicide and trauma, I think we should try to use them if it can be done safely.
Yeah, well, and I mean that's the part of it that fascinates me too. Again, I don't have near the level of experience you do, but I've seen portrayals of it. Maybe a situation where you'll see a veteran, like you said, who could conceivably benefit from this type of therapy to deal with PTSD. They have to go to Mexico or someplace, else.
Yeah.
But the process as described, as portrayed, to get you past, it seems like some of the barriers, because I mean, anybody that's taken Psych 101 understands the walls we put up and the barriers we put around things that we don't want to deal with or tough to deal with or something. And this type of treatment can kind of break those down and give you a way to reframe in your own head the meaning of the experience, the danger posed by the experience, a sense of hopelessness about it, all that kind of stuff that can lead to suicide or substance abuse, unhealthy substance abuse. And like you said, really rewire things, build some new pathways that can be transformative, potentially transformative in a fairly short period of time and with lasting success. And it really does seem too bad to me to not explore the possibilities because of the fears created by how these substances have been abused. Because there's all kinds of things get abused all the time, that have the potential for good or bad. And, it's a question of how you use them.
Yeah, I sometimes think that maybe this conversation is happening now. One, because it's just undeniable that this has had positive benefits for some people, and the studies are really, really positive. But then two, also my generation, we are far enough removed from whatever happened in the 60s and 70s. It sounds like y'all guys had a lot of fun in the 60s and 70s, or my parents' generation did, but that's not our experience. You know, these kind of drugs just weren't. I don't know. Maybe they weren't as widely used, or maybe they just weren't as big a part of the sort of culture, you know, and the sort of music scene or the movies or whatever it was, because there was clearly a sort of backlash to these substances based on the way they were abused by the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Or maybe not even abused. I don't know. You know, however it was portrayed, they have a very negative connotation. But in my generation, not quite so much. And I'll say again, it doesn't sort of, we're not talking about recreational use. We're talking about controlled medical use. And I'll say that's one thing, is there are some folks who are sort of frustrated with people like me because they don't think we're going far enough, fast enough, you know, and they want to sort of open it up. But that's just not where I think most people are at, particularly in Alaska. I think people in Alaska really value our veteran population and our law enforcement population, and really understand that addiction and addiction medicine is incredibly important. Yeah. And so they're willing to give this a shot in that. I'm hoping they're willing to give it a shot in that controlled medical space. And like I said, so far the reception has been quite positive.
Yeah, well, I mean, I look at the list of people that you hope to have, or people in institutions that you hope to have involved in the task force: commissioners from the Departments of Health, Military, and Veterans Affairs, Commerce, Community, and Economic Development, specialists from the mental health community, advocates from domestic violence and sexual assault survivor organizations, representative from the Native health community, you mentioned that, the traditional indigenous knowledge, existing psychedelic healthcare professionals, and state lawmakers all be part of this. I mean, it's not due respect to anybody who appreciates the title. It's not a bunch of hippies getting around, and you know, this is a real serious group of folks. Now let's talk though about the I mean, as you have proposed this, I've got to think that you have run into some objections. What are some of those, and how are you responding to them?
You know, we just filed it, and it just sort of came out, you know, in the release of the pre-filed bills. And so, you know, it's very new. So we haven't really had the resistance come out. There was one kind of nasty article written by this publication that writes nasty articles about everything. Yeah. And I haven't read it. I've heard it's, you know, I think it's the critique is probably what you'd expect about drugs and legalizing drugs or something like that. But I'm not sure. You know, I think that it'll be mostly, I think, education. It'll be mostly sort of explaining kind of what these substances are and what they can do, and sort of where the FDA is at. And then it'll be, frankly, just a race against the clock, like everything is in the legislature, because there's so few days to get these kind of things passed. Oh, yeah. And so if it doesn't pass this year, I think it'll be mostly because we sort of ran out of time. I would like to believe that people will be objective and reasonable and look at the facts and the data.
Yeah, well, and
conclusion that this could be really beneficial for Alaskans.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a little bit early to. I mean, there are going to be fears because of stories from the past, but it's a little bit early to know. And those are all things I would think that would come out in the meeting of this group of, like I say, if you can get all of these different organizations. I mean, do you have to recruit now from these organizations that you'd like to have represented, or are they already on board?
We have spoken to several of them. You know, if this becomes law, the departments will be required to send somebody to participate.
Sure.
And so I think where we're at right now is getting testimony from organizations and medical providers that are interested in doing this, and sort of explaining to the legislature what it is they would be doing and why they want to do it. And I have a number of doctors and psychologists and advocates and traditional healers and other folks, and even some organizations who are willing to to sort of say that on the record and explain that position.
Sure.
And then once it becomes law, we can draw together that task force, and the task force's job is to create that regulatory framework and evaluate things like, is there a danger to public health by doing this, or public safety, and what are the potential benefits? And then if you're going to license things, what would that look like, And we sort of went through that recently with cannabis, but I'll say this is very different than cannabis because it's not being driven by a ballot initiative. It's not for recreational use, and it's frankly more in line with the federal government actually than cannabis was at the time that initiative passed, ballot measure 2 back in 2014. Because, like I said, these are things that are really moving forward. So actually, this past summer, I happened to be in D.C. for a different conference that was nearby. And afterwards, I had the opportunity to meet with a friend of mine who was a state senator in Georgia, actually. And he was talking about, he went to a conference in Colorado this past summer that had like 14,000 attendees or some crazy number like that.
Wow. Because
of how many people now are interested in this potential medicine, that they are seeing its potential impacts. And I really think that this is going to become, I think this is going to go nationwide pretty quick, and maybe quicker than people realize, especially if the federal government takes action on it.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see because of course, the medicinal version, it's too bad in a way that it's coming on, that this idea is moving forward at the same time. There's so much concern over opioids because that was supposed to be something that would work for people and was administered by doctors, and then the horses kind of got out of the barn. And so I'm sure establishing the differences is going to be something you'll have to face, and then any addictive or potential for abuse or something. But that's why I keep coming back to that's why you have the task force. Nobody's pushing to make anything happen immediately. What you're trying to do, as I understand it, with your bill, is get the conversation going so we can find out.
Yes. That's right. And I'll say that you're right about opioids being sort of sold by Purdue Pharmaceuticals in the late 90s, early 2000s as this miracle drug, and then it being wildly overprescribed. I think there are some real sort of biological medical differences between these drugs and that drug, but there's also kind of a difference in motivation. There's no company pushing these. This is really more grassroots, and I'm not sure who's going to make money off of this. I don't think it's going to be nearly as centralized as opioids were or are. I don't think that's sort of how this is going to work out. I will say that some of these treatments are already happening, right? So ketamine, for example, is a substance that is already used medicinally. It's also abused recreationally. So, it's two different sides of that sword. And my understanding is that actually ketamine is quite similar to some of these other psychedelic medicines, but it was never categorized that way because of essentially for political rather than medical reasons. A lot of things ended up in the 20th century as Schedule I substances for sort of political reasons, and there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to some of the categorization at the federal level. And I think it's actually a good thing. Again, it's kind of a bipartisan thing. In the last decade or two, I think Americans are starting to reevaluate some of these things and say, is cannabis really a Schedule I substance? Like is cannabis and heroin, are they really the same thing? And not only that, but are there actually medical uses for some of these other substances, particularly if they are in a controlled setting, with medical providers? And so I think this is sort of a small step in that whole conversation. But if psychedelic medicines have the potential that people think they do, it could be an incredibly important step for some very vulnerable communities.
Sure. Well, and again, any potential for abuse, any potential for exploitation and that kind of thing. I mean, the upshot of the problems that have had with opioids is hopefully everybody's learned from that. And in a way, it's good for that to be fresh on people's mind because it brings a level of caution you might not have. Obviously, a level of caution that wasn't there when they were talking about putting opioids on the market. So everybody knows about that potential now and can monitor that.
Absolutely.
And you've got a good group of people to maybe do it.
I think that's right. And, again, I'm not a medical professional. My understanding is that psilocybin, for example, just does not have the same kind of addictive effects as opioids. But you're right that we need to be vigilant on that. And I'll say that, in Anchorage, there is also a lot of property crime associated with addicts, basically seeking to feed that habit. And that's one of the potentials of these kind of medicines. If these kind of medicines can break people's addictions to opioids, that would be hugely beneficial, not just to the people who are addicted themselves, but also to sort of the broader society in places where in some of the neighborhoods I represent, where property crime is a real challenge, and it's sort of an offshoot of addiction. And I'll say also, that's why there are sometimes folks who support these things that are not the people you'd expect, because they have had in their family the real world experience of having someone addicted to a substance.
Yeah.
And I know I've had it in my family, my extended family. And if there are these kind of medicines that can offer real hope to people fighting addiction or fighting trauma and PTSD, then people want that kind of hope, and it's those kind of things don't choose a political party, right? No. That kind of thing can happen in anybody's family.
Boy, and it's so funny that you mentioned that. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I remember in my early days of taking over KLAM in the early 90s, when you didn't even. A person would put a D or an R next to him to because the ballot sort of needed it. But when it came to getting the work done, that just wasn't much of a thing. I mean, as recently, the 90s don't seem recent to you. They still seem recent-ish to me within my adult lifetime. And I don't know how Alaska it started, how this national identity, this red and blue stuff, grafted itself onto Alaska, but where partisanship not only impacts the legislation. Well, yeah, this seems like a good idea, but it came from across the aisle, so I'm going to oppose it. That kind of nonsense. And just to the point that sometimes that it takes 20 days of a 90-day session for the House to get itself organized, that kind of stuff. I'm like, how did that happen? How did that get up here?
Well, I could, and I'll say, just the 90s seem pretty recent to me, too. I'm not that
good.
young. I still remember, and again, the very formative years, mostly in Cordova. That's a whole other conversation that
Sure.
I could speak uninterrupted for an hour about, probably, because I saw it really firsthand at the Anchorage Assembly. The Anchorage Assembly is a nonpartisan body, as are all municipal, and city council governments in Alaska. And so when I first got on the body in 2016, it was pretty nonpartisan. I mean, not completely, of course, but we mostly did roads and drainage and that kind of thing. And at least on the assembly, it was the pandemic and the sort of immediate aftermath of the pandemic that caused this wave of partisanship. And there were some folks that really, frankly, made money off of sort of getting people riled up and attacking the assembly. And that had happened earlier in the state legislature. And, these sort of national political trends and these organizations coming in, both making money and bringing money to drive partisanship. It's just sort of undeniable. It's also true that social media, unfortunately, has accelerated those trends.
Yeah.
But I will say, Alaska has sort of admirably avoided that more than most other parts of the country. It's still up here. It's still a challenge. But we have nonpartisans in our legislature. We had a nonpartisan governor at one point, an independent governor. We still have, of course, we have ranked choice voting now, which, some people hold out a lot of hope for, and we'll see how that works in the coming cycles. But, there are more independents, or actually it's nonpartisans or undeclared. There are more of those in Alaska than Democrats and Republicans combined, which is a really interesting feature of our sort of body politic here. And I think a really positive one.
Well, and the Senate still has a bipartisan majority, is that right?
Yes, we do. There's a bipartisan coalition I'm a part of with 9 Democrats and 8 Republicans. And that is a miracle in the rest of the country.
Yeah.
In Alaska, it's a little more common. We've had bipartisan coalitions. Actually, they're pretty frequent. They kind of go back and forth between the House and the Senate. And part of that is the impact of rural Alaska and the Bush Dems, from Western Alaska in particular, would caucus with the Republicans and are doing so in the House right now. Yeah. And then, in the Senate, we have a 17-member bipartisan coalition. Yeah. And, we're kind of built around the idea that you try to do good work that the people of Alaska want, and we try to avoid the most controversial issues. Now, it doesn't mean it always happens, right? But we work in caucus to try to avoid, some of the social issues, for example, from getting to the floor, and really stirring people up. And I think so far, at least, this is only my second year doing this, but so far, at least, it's been really positive.
Yeah, well, I mean, when the news release came in that caught my attention, of course, your name always catches my attention, but when this topic came up, it says Alaska Senate Majority right up there at the top, and so that's I maybe I'm being overly pessimistic about the infection of hyperpartisan. Because that's of course what makes
pessimistic enough.
Yeah, I suppose so.
It's a challenge. I mean, it's a real problem. Alaska has done better than the rest of the country, but the rest of the country is sort of a large portion of it sort of fallen into chaos. So
this idea that a good idea, the concept that a good idea can be opposed just because of who came up with it, just really frosts me. I mean, I remember that there was a largely. Oh, I can't remember the guy's name. It was back, when they were in the gas line days, when there was largely bipartisan support from the gas line. Again, this would have been early 90s, and I don't even remember if it was a senator or a representative that represented Cordova at the time was in the political minority, but was actually leading the charge for what the state kind of seemed to want for a gas line at that point. And you didn't hear. I mean, it was. The focus was on the idea and not who came up with the idea. And I'm so tired of this, that if somebody from a blue state comes up with a cure for cancer, it's a bad idea because it came from blue state or vice versa. And it's just so there is, I mean, your boots on the ground there is so some of that idea driven work, you still see that happening in our state?
Yes.
Yes and
but,
no.
I mean, certainly not as much as a lot of people would want it to.
Yeah.
And again, this is a kind of a longer conversation for another day, and I don't want to point too many fingers, but I'd say there's also people feel pressure from certain other groups and feel like, yes, I could vote for this. Yes, I know it's a good idea, but then I'll lose my seat, because I'll be attacked by some talk radio, for example, or by, and that's just really, really difficult, and it's really difficult to overcome because, folks feel like folks will tell you one thing to your face and then they'll say something very different in public because they know that they have to sort of keep up that appearance or they'll be attacked, and I'm not saying, it happens in the House and in the Senate for sure. And that's, I think, our legislative bodies are, there are certainly institutional challenges, but to a certain degree, they're also reflections of ourselves and our society. Yeah. And there's just a lot of folks right now who kind of indulge in hate, if that makes sense, indulge in the anger.
Oh,
they turn on the radio, not your radio program, of course. They turn on some other radio. They drive 45 minutes to work, just being angry the whole way, and just being fed a bunch of, frankly, lies. A lot of that stuff isn't true, but it feels good to have your sort of biases confirmed. You can get really mad at somebody, and then of course you go on social media and there is somebody else, feeding you a bunch of stuff, and they make money off of it. They make money off of keeping you angry, And the funny thing is when you go door to door, which I've had the opportunity to do, that's usually not what people want to talk about. People want to talk about fixing their road or fixing snow removal or the food stamps got delayed because the system is down, whatever it is. And they're not as interested in some of the stuff that kind of drives clicks or drives ratings.
Right. Yeah. And those, again, with the rise of interconnectivity that, I felt for a while, actually in my experience, it was the start of the 24/7 news cycle that really launched that, because instead of just, news producers, instead of just having to fill an hour on weekday nights, now they're having to find 24/7 constant material. And so that means you don't just report on the issue. First you say, here's the issue. Here's somebody that hates it. Here's somebody that thinks it's great. They're going to yell at each other and you can't hear what anybody is saying. And, now of course, now, as you well know, I'm sure you have the situation where the outlets have become polarized and not really true news organizations anymore. So, yeah, we should talk about that some other time. I think that would be fun. But
yeah, fun, maybe a little bit depressing.
Yeah,
I'll say one last thing before I move on. Before I move on from this,
yeah.
I don't want. I'm not doing kind of like a reflexive both siderism thing either. I'll say that I still believe that there is kind of objective truth, and that's one of the first things that's been sort of destroyed in the last, however it is, 5 or 10 years.
Sure.
This notion that, like you said, two people arguing about something as opposed to one person explaining the truth about that thing, right? And so, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was this moderate Republican from New York, he said, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts.
Yeah.
And I still believe that is the case. And we kind of live, unfortunately, in this world where even basic facts will become polarized or become sort of an object of like partisanship.
Because it's just more fun. It's just more fun to have it that way. Let me ask you in conclusion, we've been talking about your task force. What are some other things that you're going to be focused on, maybe at the state level? I'm sure there's a lot for your district, but what can we expect you to be paying attention to in the coming session?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot. I'll just say the Bipartisan Coalition has 3 primary sort of goals. One is to increase education funding, which we think is long overdue. Education got flat funded starting in 2017. Inflation has eaten away these school budgets, so that's one. Second is restoring a defined benefit pension for public workers. Both my parents retired with a defined benefit pension, and the research we're seeing indicates that, and what we're hearing from sort of police, firefighters, school teachers, others, is we're having a real hard time recruiting and retaining people in Alaska because we don't offer a pension. We offer sort of 401k system that really isn't competitive. And by the way, you can vest and then move out of state after 5 years. So we're losing a lot of experienced people. So that's number 2. And then 3 is the high cost of energy. Cordova, too, it's very much to its credit, invested early in hydropower, and because of that has been, to a certain degree, shielded by some of the energy costs in other parts of the state. Excuse me. And in Anchorage and in South Central, we have a real problem with the reliability and availability of affordable natural gas. That is going to become a crisis, frankly, in the next couple of years, because easily recoverable gas out of the inlet is a real challenge. And so there's a lot of ideas about how we fix that. There's an omnibus bill that's going to be coming forward. There's some federal money we got through Lisa Murkowski's office that hopefully we'll be able to upgrade some of the transmission lines. So that's sort of the Bipartisan Coalition's goals. Personally, I have a couple of other bills I'm working on. One to improve the Alaska Performance Scholarship to help it become inflation-proof. Another to try to address some of the high costs of housing that really are a problem in Anchorage, but they're a problem everywhere. And I have a few other bills too, but the sort of overall thrust of what I'm trying to do is to make Alaska a more affordable and vibrant place so that young people want to, not just young people, but everyone wants to remain here or raise their families here. Because what we're seeing is Alaska is losing a lot of our working age population, and Anchorage is really losing a lot too. And we've got to find a way to recruit and retain people here in Alaska. Yeah,
well, and I mean, I couldn't agree more with the idea of moving in that direction, because that really defines my life. Being an Alaskan, it never occurred to me to ever want to go anywhere else. The only substantial time I spent out of state was in college, and I thought, okay, well, lower 48 experience, great. But, the opportunities for me are in Alaska, and I would really like to see younger generations be positioned to be able to feel that way. So I hope that's successful, and you do your years in Cordova proud, Forrest. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with people outside your district and and share more about this. It's fascinating stuff. By the way, how can people find out that want to look more into what you're doing? Do you have your own site or how that want to follow up on the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force and its potential? What would you recommend as a resource?
I think the best thing would be to visit the state legislative website. I don't have like an independent website of my own, but you can find my office's website on the state legislative website, and then there'll be bill language and all the rest of it. You can also send me an email. It's just sen.forrest.dunbar@akledge.gov.
Okay.
Again, sen.forrest.dunbar@akledge.gov, and my office will get that, and we are happy to respond with other materials or people want to get involved. People are going to be offering testimony. If you have the opportunity to come to Juneau, that'd be great, but certainly not necessary.
Yeah.
And so that would be the best way, either the state legislative website or please email my office.
Well, and any of you hearing this, the on-demand version of this on the YouTube channel, that if I remember, and if I didn't remember, let me know that I forgot, any of you using the YouTube channel, to put a link to the things that he just talked about, the email address and the site in the description of that video.
Great.
Hey, it's been a thrill. Nice to have your voice projecting over the court. Of course, they're AM airwaves, not FM airwaves, which is where you got your big start in broadcasting. Forrest Dunbar, thank you very much, and we hope you have a great session.
Thank you, JR. Talk to you soon.
And there you have it, our visit with Senator Dunbar, known in the Cordova school system as Forrest Dunbar, those many years ago, discussing his pre-filed legislation that could establish an Alaska Mental Health and Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. Pretty fascinating stuff. If I can scrounge up some links to put in the description of the YouTube version of this, then they'll be down there. As I'm sure many of you know, after our programs play on the radio, we archive them at youtube.com/Cordova TV. So anybody that's interested in hearing the program again, especially if you maybe came in late, want to hear it from the beginning, if you want to pass it on to other folks, I imagine Forrest's mom is going to want to hear the program. So if you're listening, Forrest's mom, hi. Great to have you tuned in or clicked in or whatever it is. Have to imagine she's very, very proud. Big thanks again to Cordova Wireless Communications. They're the ones that make it possible for us to do this on demand, of course, as we've always said. We don't just sit around and talk about nothing for the sake of doing it. There's a topic, a prearranged topic on a prearranged day. And if you ever have any ideas for a program that we could do that would be of interest to you, then just let me know. Pretty easy. You can be a guest. You can recommend one. Recommend a topic, and we'll try to find a guest. It's a very symbiotic relationship. And Cordova Wireless is the long time sponsor of this, and a big financial force, of course, in Cordova because of all that outside money that they bring in, which is why it's a particular benefit for us to be customers of theirs and of CTC. All of the regular features that you are owed in the 10 a.m. hour will be coming up here. Thanks again for tuning into the Town Meeting program. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next time.